Welcome to the Digital Identity Digest, the audio companion to the blog at Spherical Cow Consulting. I'm Heather Flanagan, and every week I break down interesting topics in the field of digital identity, from credentials and standards to browser weirdness and policy twists. If you work with digital identity but don't have time to follow every specification or hype cycle, you're in the right place. Let's get into it. And welcome back to the Digital Identity Digest. I'm Heather Flanagan, and today we're going to dig into one of those invisible but very real limits on our digital future, and that is supply chains. Now, I know supply chains don't generally sound nearly as exciting as AI agents or new internet protocols, but stay with me through this one because without that physical stuff, the chips, the minerals, the power, and the people, all of those really clever protocols and powerful algorithms don't amount to much. So this episode builds on two of my earlier blog posts. One on who really pays for AI, where I argue that AI always comes with a bill in water, electricity, and silicon. And the other called The End to the Global Internet, which is where I look at how fragmentation is reshaping the network itself, because the supply chain is going to be one of those things that limits how far both AI and fragmentation can actually go. So today we're going to put those two threads together, because if you really want to understand the future of technology, you can't just look at the code or the protocols. You have to look at the supply chains. So let me start with a story. On a recent flight, I do travel quite a bit, so I'm often on airplanes. My seatmate was reading a book about artificial intelligence. Go him. At one point, he leaned over and described this idea of an infinitely growing AI. And I mean, I really kind of couldn't help myself but giggle a little bit because I was like, you do know that's impossible, right? Because computers are not infinite. And then I explained why. There just aren't enough chips, enough fabs, enough minerals, enough power plants, or enough trained people on the planet to sustain an infinite anything, right? That's not a matter of imagination. It's a matter of physics, chemistry, and labor. So that exchange captured a problem I keep seeing in conversations about AI, identity, and the internet. We treat protocols as if they're the bottleneck. But, really, at the end of the day, if you go far enough, it's the supply chains underneath that are going to constrain things. So let's break that down. Let's talk about chips and fabricators, also known as fabs. All right, the most advanced semiconductors come out of fabrication plants that cost just tens of billions of dollars to build. And these fabs takes years, sometimes up to a decade, to plan and bring online. And even then, the whole process hinges on one company. Yes, one, only one. That company is based in the Netherlands and it's called ASML. They're the only supplier of extreme ultraviolet lithography machines. Without those machines, you simply can't make the latest generation of chips. And the delivery backlogs for those are measured in years, right? Then there's minerals and materials. Like every device you have in your pocket, every server in the data center depends on a whole range of fairly rare inputs. Lithium for batteries, cobalt for electrodes, rare earth elements for magnets, neon for chip making lasers, and high purity quartz for wafers, right? Those resources are not evenly distributed on the planet, right? China actually refines the vast majority of rare earths. Ukraine has historically supplied half the world's neon, and there's no substitute for the massive amounts of water required for semiconductor production. And water isn't evenly distributed either. So next, power and cooling. Training a frontier AI model doesn't just use a lot of electricity, it uses like gigawatt hours of power. And running a hyperscale data center can consume as much water as a small city. And when power grids are strained, there's just no clever standard or protocol that can conjure new electrons out of thin air. And finally, like people, right? None of this runs itself. Chip designers, process engineers, clean room technicians, miners, metallurgists, these are all very highly specialized skills. And many of the people who hold them are approaching retirement, right? Training their replacements takes years, not months. And immigration restrictions make it even harder to replenish the talent pool. I've got a whole post coming on the demographics and how that's going to impact internet futures, but stay tuned for that later this month. So yes, protocols do matter, but they're not the limiting factor, right? The hard limits come from the physical world. So, yeah, geopolitics and demographics, right? The internet has been described as global and borderless, but the hardware that makes it work is not. Every link in the supply chain is tied up in geopolitics, right? The United States leads in chip design, but it depends on Taiwan and South Korea for cutting edge manufacturing. China absolute dominates rare earth refining, but it still relies on imports of high end chip making tools that it can't actually produce domestically at this point. Europe has the niche strengths in lithography and specialty equipment, but it lacks the scale for any kind of full independence. It doesn't have the materials. And then there's countries like Japan, India, and Australia. They supply critical inputs, silicone wafers, rare earth ores, specialty chemicals, but they don't have a hot entire stack either. Now, this interdependence wasn't actually accidental. I mean, it is in part, well, there's stuff on the planet. You can't quite make it be somewhere it isn't, right? But more than that, it was the product of decades of globalization where each region specialized where it had a comparative advantage, probably because it had stuff. And that makes the whole system efficient, but it also makes it fairly fragile, right? And then there's the demographic dimension. Skilled engineers and technicians are aging out of the workforce. Sneak preview of the future demographic post, right? The average age of someone in the US is 39 years old, right? 15 years or so, guess what? You're not going to have the replacements that you might want because they will have aged out of the system, as it were. So, right, young replacements not being traced fast enough, they might not be there to train, right? And even if the mineral and the fabricators were available, we may not have the people to keep everything running. So the story isn't just about where resources are located, though that's a big deal. It's also about who can actually put them to use. So we have an illusion of resilience right now because for decades, efficiency ruled. Tech companies built just in time supply chains, manufacturers outsourced the lowest cost, reliable suppliers, investors punished redundancy as waste. And that worked until it didn't. That efficiency gave us cheap smartphones, affordable cloud services, and rapid innovation in AI. But it also created some brittle systems where a single disruption could just cascade globally. And it's not like we haven't seen that happen. When a tsunami hit Japan in 2011, semiconductor production was disrupted for months. When a drought hit Taiwan in 2021, chip makers had to truck in water to keep their fabs online. When the war in Ukraine cut off neon supplies, the entire semiconductor ecosystem felt that, right? And then there was the whole 2020 to 2023 global chips shortage. A pandemic driven spike collided with all of those supply shocks: a fire at a Japanese chip plant, drought in Taiwan, geopolitical conflict in Ukraine, right? Automakers idled their plants, consumer electronic prices spiked, and lead times stretched to years. That was just kind of the warm up, right? Because AI at scale magnifies all of this fragility. Training a large model requires thousands of specialized GPUs. If one upstream material, let's say gallium, which I never heard of before I actually researched this post, by the way, and is essential for semiconductors, if that gets squeezed, which is happening, it doesn't matter how advanced your algorithms are because the model won't get trained. So much for an infinite AI. Okay, so now let's zoom out to the internet itself. Even as the internet fragments into national or regional spheres, which is something also known as splinternet, the supply chains underneath have to remain global. You can wall off your data flows, you can enforce national identity systems, but you cannot build advanced technology entirely within your own borders without enormous trade offs. I mean, think about it. A US data center might run on American designed chips, but those chips likely contain rare earths refined in China. A Chinese smartphone might be assembled domestically, but the lithography machines that pattern its chips come from Europe. An EU startup might host its AI models on European servers, but the GPUs were packaged and tested in Southeast Asia. Fragmentation at the governance level does not erase these dependencies, it only adds more complexity as governments try to dictate who trades with whom, under what terms, and under what safeguards. I mean, this is actually why the myth of digital sovereignty, I think, is so misleading. You can be sovereign over your protocols, maybe even over standards. You can certainly be sovereign over your regulations, but you cannot be sovereign over the minerals you don't have, the fabricators you can't build, or the workforces that you don't have to train. So, if infinite AI is impossible and total independence is unrealistic, so what's the alternative? Well, one answer is regional diversity. Instead of betting on one perfectly resilient global supply chain, we can design multiple overlapping regional ones. Each region may not be fully independent, but together they reduce the risk of one failure breaks all. This is not novel thinking. We're already seeing this play out in the United States. The Chips and Sciences Act, which is under question, granted, but it poured billions into domestic semiconductor manufacturing. In the European Union, the Raw Materials Alliance is working to secure critical mineral supplies and boost recycling. Japan and South Korea are duplicating supply chain segments that were once dominated by China, especially for battery materials. And India has very ambitious plans for chip fabricators and global assembly hubs through what it calls its semiconductor mission, right? Now, countries like Australia and Canada are positioning themselves not just as extractor of critical minerals, but as refiners and processors, adding some useful resilience to the system. Quick side note, a few years ago, I went to Iceland, which is where I found out that Australia would ship large tankers of aluminum ore all the way from Australia to Iceland for refining because Iceland had cheap power. And it was actually that much cheaper to do it that way than to just build the systems locally. And yet now we're in a world where they're actually going to try, Australia's going to try and do that. So yeah, these regional efforts are going to come with trade-offs. They are more expensive, they take longer, and they sometimes duplicate effort, which I think we've all been trained to see of as inefficient. But they're also creating buffers. If one region falters, right, the other can pick up the slack. And in the process, they can introduce some more design diversity, not just in technology, but in regulation, governance, and labor practices. Makes life interesting. So let's go back to the airplane conversation, right? The myth of the infinite AI isn't just bad science fiction, right? It's a misunderstanding of how technology actually works. AI, like the internet itself, is bounded by the real world. The protocols matter, but they're only the top layer. Beneath them are the chips, the minerals, the power, and the people. And the irony of all that, even as the internet fragments, the supply chains that support it remain it irreducibly global. You just can't not be global to a certain extent. A smartphone, a GPU, a solar panel, none of these are truly national products. They're planetary collaborations. The challenge isn't to imagine a future where supply chains disappear or where we annex Greenland or something ridiculous. It's not about achieving total independence. The challenge is to design systems, regional and global, that acknowledge these limits and build resilience into them. Now, when I wrote The End of the Global Internet, I wanted to show that fragmentation isn't hypothetical. It's already happening. But fragmentation does not erase interdependence. It just makes it a whole lot messier. And when I wrote Who Really Pays for AI, I wanted to highlight that scaling computation is not a free lunch. You can't do it infinitely. The costs are real, and they are measured in water, electricity, and silicon. And I wanted this episode to tie both those threads together. The real bottleneck in technology are not the protocols we argued about in standards bodies. There's the supply chains that determine whether the chips, the power, the mineral, and the people exist in the first place. AI is a vivid example because its appetite is enormous, but the lesson applies to the entire digital ecosystem. The internet is fracturing into spheres of influence, but those spheres will still be bound together by the pipelines that crisscross borders. So the next time you hear someone talking about infinite AI or treating it as if it's a completely renewable resource, as it were, or if they're talking about a fully sovereign internet, remember this: computers are not infinite, and supply chains cannot be sovereign. So the real question isn't whether we can escape those facts, it's how we build systems that can thrive within them. Phew, well, that was a lot. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Digital Identity Digest. If you enjoyed the episode, obviously share it with other people. Talk about it online if there is stuff you really agreed with or stuff you really didn't. And until next time, Heather Flanagan, happily translating the geek world to human. And that's it for this week's episode of the Digital Identity Digest. If it helps make things a little clearer, or at least a little more interesting, share it with a friend or colleague and connect with me on LinkedIn at HL Flanagan. And if you enjoyed the show, do be sure to subscribe and leave me a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also find the written full post at sphericalcowconsulting.com. Now stay curious, stay engaged, and let's get these conversations going.